In the next few sections, I'm going to talk about how to understand semantic memory in terms of anatomy and physiology. And semantic memory includes quite a lot of related but somewhat different phenomena. It includes the ability to recall facts, like Ottawa is the capital of Canada, and concepts, like a year is the period over which the seasons repeat, or more abstractly, a year is the time required for the Earth to go once around the Sun. And knowing the meanings of words is a critical way in which we apply these semantic memories. An important characteristic of semantic memory is that in general we don't remember when and where we learned a memory. Many people know that Paris is the capital of France, but very few remember when and where they learned that fact. And that's true for most of the words in our vocabulary. We don't remember learning them. Semantic memory is being investigated in the lab. In a typical test, a subject is shown a picture of an object and asked if it belongs to a particular category, and the time the subject takes to come up with the correct answer is measured. The tip of the tongue phenomenon has also been investigated, which is when you can't remember something but feel you are almost remembering. So it can reveal something about the kind of processing that's going on. What we've established so far in the course is that if we describe a phenomenon in terms of activation of cortical columns and interpretation of column activations as behavior recommendations, then we know how to map that kind of description through multiple levels all the way down to neurochemistry. So what I'm going to do is establish that kind of high-level description of semantic memory, and only occasionally go to deeper levels as a reminder that the mapping exists, and as a reminder of how it's done. And the column mechanism that's critical to semantic memory is the activation of inactive cortical columns, not because their receptive fields are present within current sensory inputs, but because they've often been active in the past at the same time as columns that are currently active. We'll use this simplified model for the cortex, with columns in different areas detecting receptive fields at different levels of complexity. Some areas detect receptive fields within information derived from just one sense, and they're sometimes called unimodal or monomodal. More complex receptive fields are defined by information derived from multiple senses, and these are called multimodal or polymodal. Each area defines receptive fields that are combinations of those defined by one or several preceding areas. And I haven't illustrated what's often called feedback connectivity from more complex to simpler areas. We'll address this type of connectivity a little later. In the monomodal visual processing areas, receptive fields close to sensory input detect receptive fields that are able to discriminate between different elements in the visual field, like the example from area V2 in the bottom left. More complex receptive fields can discriminate between different visual features. An example from visual area V4 is shown. Yet more complex areas discriminate between different types of visual object, groups of objects, groups of groups, and so forth. And some of these could actually be polymodal fields, but for the moment I'll just think of them as visual. Now recall that when I say discriminate, I mean that individual receptive fields don't correspond with individual cognitive categories, but the groups of receptive fields detected within different members of one category are sufficiently similar to each other and sufficiently different from the groups detected within other categories that it's possible to assign recommendation strengths to the receptive fields in such a way that high-integrity category identifications are possible. And in an example I've used before, receptive fields detected in the area most effective for discriminating between different types of objects may look a bit like this, as I've shown again in the bottom left. They don't look like objects we can name, but functionally they can be used to identify different categories of objects. And I've been using this symbol to mean discriminate in the sense I've just defined. And I'm labeling areas by the types of discriminations they are most effective making. But again, in reality, several areas may contribute to discriminations of one type, and the more complex discriminations may well be multimodal. But this simple model will serve for understanding at this level. Monomodal auditory areas also detect receptive fields on increasing levels of complexity. Areas with receptive fields that can discriminate between phonemes or comparable complexity sounds, pass detections to areas that can discriminate between different words, and so on. Again, in a later lecture, we'll cover speech processing in much more detail. Then there are multimodal areas that detect receptive fields defined by information derived from multiple senses. And these areas can discriminate between rather more complex circumstances. So, I'll use this model to start on understanding semantic memory. Suppose a bird is seen. Receptive fields will be detected at the visual elements level in the first area. The next area detects receptive fields able to discriminate effectively between visual features, the next level between visual objects. I've conceptually illustrated the pattern of activity by colouring a subset of columns red to indicate receptive field detection. This is a very useful approximation for understanding, but it is approximate, and at this point let me comment on the deeper level of description. It's important to be aware that there is a more precise, deeper level, but most of the time the high-level description is fully adequate. So, to move to a slightly different level, recall that a column is a group of pyramidal neuron resources. The neuron receptive fields are all relatively similar compared with the receptive fields in other columns. And the reason for this organization is to conserve resources. For example, an area has a wide range of inputs, but a small subset of those inputs are all that's needed for the neurons in one column because of the similarity of their receptive fields. So you can save on connectivity resources. And just as important, the receptive field similarities mean the brain can use columns to manage receptive field expansions. Inside a column, the pyramidal neurons are arranged in layers. And remember, inputs arrive in layer 4, outputs from layer 4 go to layers 2, 3, and outputs from 2, 3 to 5, 6. So in terms of information flow, layers 2, 3 are the middle layers, which is the way I've illustrated it. If a lot of neurons are detecting their receptive fields in all layers, including the output layers, then the approximation is that column's detecting its receptive field. If very few neurons are detecting their receptive fields and none in the output layer, that column isn't detecting its receptive field. But in reality, it's not quite that simple. Remember, there's about 10,000 neurons in a column. So columns can differ in the number of neuron receptive field detections in their output layer. If there's a bit less output activity, the column can still be regarded as detecting its receptive field. If there's quite a lot of internal activity but no output, the column is still not detecting its field, although this will be a candidate for receptive field expansion if necessary. But if the number of output neurons detecting their field is very small, we might regard that column as not detecting its field. But remember that the neurons in one column tend to detect similar receptive fields. So there could be a tendency for the more extreme cases to be a bit more common than the intermediate cases. And of course, columns with intermediate layer activity and no or minimal output are candidates for receptive field expansion. And again, that isn't completely black and white. Sometimes a column with a bit more output could be selected. So if we want higher precision, we need to shift to a neuron level of description. But we know what approximations we're making, and we know how to go to the deeper level as required, and how to map back up from the deeper level. So we can confidently use column level descriptions for cognitive phenomena. And this is where we were before we digressed. the description at the column level of the activation in response to seeing a bird. If the word bird is heard, receptive fields will be detected at the phoneme level, then in the area able to discriminate between different words. If the word is heard at the same time as the bird is seen, there'll be parallel cascades of receptive field detection. But for the moment, let's just focus on the area that discriminates between visual objects and the area that discriminates between words. And draw the areas like this, with more columns conceptually illustrated. An area probably has the order of around 10,000 columns. Illustrated in red are all the columns that sometimes detect their receptive fields in response to visual experiences of birds. All these columns will have some recommendation strengths in the basal ganglia in favour of behaviours like saying that's a bird. But of course, not all of the columns in red will detect their receptive fields in every visual bird experience, and all of those columns will sometimes detect their receptive fields in visual experiences of other types of objects, and they'll have recommendation strengths in favour of behaviours appropriate to those other types of objects. A similar situation exists in the auditory area for hearing the word bird. Many different columns could detect their receptive fields in different experiences in which the same word was spoken by different people with different emphasis and tone and so on. As I mentioned, for a specific visual bird experience, only a subset of all these columns will be activated, and the subset will be different for different birds. But because there are some visual similarities between birds, some columns will tend to detect their receptive fields somewhat more often in different bird experiences, like the ones I've indicated by the green arrows. None of those indicated columns are activated by every bird experience. It's just that they tend to be detected relatively often. And a very similar situation exists for experiences of hearing the word bird. In each experience, a different subset. But once again, because of the similarities between the different ways the word is spoken, some auditory columns will tend to be activated rather more often than others when the word is heard. Again, not always, just more frequently. But notice what's happened. Because there have been a number of experiences in which the bird was seen and the word bird was heard at the same time, there's a group of visual columns that's often been active in the past at the same time as a group of auditory columns. So let's think about what will happen if the word bird is heard in the future, after all these experiences, in the absence of an actual bird. Auditory columns will be activated, and there's a reasonable chance that some of the columns often activated in response to hearing the word in the past will be activated this time. If these auditory columns can acquire recommendation strengths in favour of indirect activation of visual columns on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity, and if these recommendation strengths are accepted, the effect will be indirect activation of many of the visual columns that were often active in the past when birds were seen. Let's step back for a moment and think about the other visual processing areas. The indirect activation based on frequent past simultaneous activity will tend to be in the area that discriminates between visual objects. Columns in other areas will have much less temporally correlated activity. In any bird experience, the receptive fields detected in the area discriminating between different visual elements will depend upon the exact positioning of the image on the retina, and the fields will vary considerably between different experiences. So there'll be much less temporal correlation between those columns and auditory columns. That means the indirectly activated population won't be experienced as a visual hallucination. It'll tend to be a vague, fuzzy impression of a bird, a kind of weighted average of many past bird experiences, but not in cortical areas close to sensory inputs. But the activated columns will have a range of bird-appropriate recommendation strengths. And actually, there may be some degree of past temporal consistency in activation between objects area columns and the area that discriminates between visual features like wings, feathers, beak, head, tail, feet, and so on. So it may be possible for a second stage of indirect activation to activate columns in the earlier level, making available recommendation strengths in favor of behaviors like describing the features. And also, if there's some consistency in the past experiences of groups of objects, birds often seen in trees, for example, another stage of indirect activation could lead to columns that were activated during such past experiences, with recommendation strengths in favor of describing them. Now, note that columns and neurons don't need to know anything about visual categories or words. The only information required at these physiological levels is about frequencies of past simultaneous activity. So, hearing the word provides a route for accessing a lot of recommendation strengths about the visual object, all using only information that can be available to neurons and columns. So in the next section, we'll have a closer look at some of the connectivity between columns and neurons that supports the indirect activation mechanisms.